Okay, so back in our IDE, we have our database connection strings. We want to use it in our application to connect to our Neon database. Now, there are a number of ways to create database connections on the Java platform and on the Jakarta EE platform. The concept of data sources is mostly associated with Jakarta EE or previously Java EE, and a data source is pretty much an abstraction of connection information to a specific database. So think of a data source. When we say a data source, think of it as the address to or how to connect to a database, a specific database on a specific server from your application. You can create a number of data sources and link them to different components in your application, but for our purposes, we just want one data source. And since a data source is an abstraction of connection information to a specific database on a specific server, then naturally you can guess the fields needed to create a data source. Now, there are different ways of creating data sources on the Jakarta EE platform. The three of them, the three common ones, are creating the data source directly in the application runtime or the server, as you would call it, the application server, or using the web.xml, or using the annotation. I prefer the annotation because I find it to be cleaner and it's available right in the code so you can read it. So we are going to do that, but you can research on your own different ways of creating the data sources in Jakarta EE applications. So here we are going to use the data source definition annotation. Now let's look at this annotation. As you can see here, it says it's an annotation used to define a container data source to be registered with the JNDI. So essentially we are creating an abstraction that contains information including the user, the password, the JDBC URL, the server URL to our Postgres database that we just created on Neon. So the data source is going to encapsulate that. Now back to our annotation here, you can see I am annotating a bean class. A bean in Jakarta EE is any class or component that is managed by the dependency injection framework Jakarta CDI. So as you can see here, I am annotating a CDI bean annotated at application scope. This class could be in any scope, shouldn't really matter. I am annotating this class with at application scope because I need a single instance of this, and I'm saying at data source definition. Now the interesting part of this annotation that we are using here is that we are sort of dynamically passing the connection strings to the annotation. Now here you can see we are using some constant here with some variable here. Now this is the microprofile config expression. What we are doing here is that we are passing configuration values to this annotation. We are not passing the actual values. We are passing variables that can be and will be substituted at runtime with the actual values that we intend. Now this is very powerful because it means that you can set different values for your data source in different environments. So here we are not going to bundle the values with the application. The application is simply going to be just that. It's going to use the variables we are defining here, and then at runtime, the values that we inject to the runtime are going to be taken and given to our application to work with. So in your development on your machine, for instance, you can have different connection strings to a different database server somewhere. And then for instance, in testing, you can have different connection strings to a different database, could be the test database. And then in production, you can have different connection strings to a different database in production. So that is how powerful using microprofile config is to configure things like the data source. So let's go through it. Here we have the name. This is the JNDI name. So we are setting this name. We are binding this this data source to this name so we can look it up. Most of the time you wouldn't literally look up Now, there are advanced cases where you will be using JNDI, but most of the time you'll be using injection and all that. So just think of it as binding the data source. This data source definition here, whatever will be created from it will be bound to this name. So if we use this name, we are going to get the data source that is created from those connection strings. And then we have the class name. This is an implementation, a data source implementation for the particular database you want to connect to. In our case, we are using Postgres, so we are just using the implementation from Postgres. Now, also you could use microprofile config to set the class name. That is, if you are using different database types in different environments, as I stated. So on your local machine, in test, in staging, in pre-production, and then in production, you could have different databases, but I don't think that is very common. So we can simply hard code the class implementation here. And then we come to the URL. This is the JDBC URL here. You can see we are passing it as a variable. And then for the database name, we are passing it as a variable, the server name, the user, and then the password. These are all things that we want to be dynamic, one. And two, we don't want to bundle with our application. We want to make these values or the values for these variables available only in the environment where the application is running and not bundle with the application itself. So we are separating the connection strings from the data source. We are separating the connection strings from the data source definition here, so we are not coupled with it. We can dynamically change it. So using the microprofile config expression, you can see we have been able to set, or we have set these values here. Now, after doing this, there are two things we need to do. One, we need to add the database driver to our application. So let's go to our POM file, pom.xml. So if I open my POM file here, I would need, nope, not this. POM file, this one. Nope. Yes, my POM file. So I'll need to add the database. So this is my database driver. This is my Postgres database driver. Remember, we are connecting to a Postgres server. So that is exactly what we are doing here. So I'm connecting to my database server. I need a driver. So I've added my driver here. And the second thing we need to do is to use this JNDI name to create our persistence unit. Now, think of a persistence unit as a grouping, a collection of entities that should be managed together. Think of it at an abstract level like that. It's a collection of JPA entities that should be managed together. So let's go to our persistence.xml file. And here you can see I'm setting my JTA data source to the exact name we set for our data source definition here. So now we are using our data source in our persistence.xml file. So pretty much this is all you need to create a data source to a database, and this database could be local, it could be hosted. In our case, since we are in the cloud, our database is also hosted in the cloud, so we can get more time to focus on our application and not try to manage the database updates and this and server, and we don't want to do that. We want to just spend time delivering value to our customers. So we are using the cloud hosted database, and so we've set up our connection strings here, used it in our persistence file here, added the driver to our database. Now, next up, let's look at our entities and then what we should expect to see in the database when we finally connect to it.